I was a scalar until you came into my life, and now I am a vector. So that is our topic for today. Talks about the scalar and vector quantities. So scalar and the vector quantities. So what is the difference between a scalar and a vector quantities? How can we differentiate these two quantities? So a scalar and a vector quantity. But before we differentiate a scalar and a vector quantity, first let's have a review on what is the meaning of a magnitude and a direction. I think you are already familiar with a magnitude and a direction. Okay, so as a review, when we say magnitude, it is a quantity of something or a numerical value with units. So that is a magnitude. So when we say magnitude, it is a quantity of something or a numerical value with units. Okay, an example of a magnitude is a 16 meters or 3 kilometers, a 58 grams, 6 foot, or 33 seconds, or 5 minutes. So those are an examples of a magnitude. Okay. On the other hand, when we say direction, it tells us which way something is going. Okay, an example of direction is north, east, west, and south, which is describes in degrees. And also, an example is to the right, to the left, up or down. So those are an example of direction. So magnitude is a numerical value with units, and direction tells us which way something is going. So what is the relation of magnitude and direction to the difference between a scalar and a vector quantity? So what is the difference between these two quantities? So I was a scalar and now I am a vector. Okay, so how can we differentiate these two quantities? Okay, so when we say scalar, okay, a scalar quantity, so when we say scalar quantity, it only have magnitude. Okay, so when we say scalar quantities, it is only magnitude. So when we say magnitude, so therefore it is only a numerical value with units, and it has no direction. Okay, I repeat, it has no direction. So scalar quantity, it is only magnitude and it has no direction. Okay, so some examples of scalar quantities, we have the distance, the mass, the time, and the speed. So these numerical values are just a units or a numerical value with units, and they have no direction. Okay, for example, the speed. So speed is 9 meter per second. So it is only a numerical value with units and it has no direction. While on the other hand, when we say vector quantities, okay, vector quantities both have magnitude and direction. Okay, so vector quantities, it has magnitude as well as direction. Okay, so an example of vector quantities is displacement, the force, the weight, and the velocity. Okay, so these are some example of vector quantities. So it has a um, it is a numerical value, and it also has a direction. For example, for the force. Okay, if you are pushing an object, so therefore you are applying a force to an object, as well as it has a direction in pushing an object. For example, if you are fronting to the right, so therefore, if you push an object, then the direction of that particular object is going to the right. So that is the reason that vector quantities has magnitude as well as direction. So sa recap, okay, as a recap, so to differentiate vector and scalar, scalar only has magnitude and it has no direction, while vector has magnitude as well as it has a direction. So that is the difference between a scalar and a vector quantities. So an example of a scalar and a vector quantities is the distance and the displacement. Okay, so distance is an example of a scalar, and displacement is an example of a vector. Okay, so why does distance is an example of a vector, scalar, and a displacement is an example of a vector? And what is the difference between distance and displacement? Okay, so for example, if you are traveling from your home to your school, so if you travel from your home to your school by land or through a land transportation, so you travel 16 kilometers and then left turn and then travel 12 kilometer. So that is how you travel from your home to your school through a land transportation. But if you travel straight from your home to your school, for example, uh, dato yun kay ka, or for example, masyado talaga kayong mayaman, then meron kayong sariling chopper or meron kayong sariling helicopter. So you travel through air. So above, so since walang traffic above and um, walang sagabal, so you travel from your home to your school straight. So, and that is only for 20 kilometers. Okay, so in this given illustration, how can we differentiate distance and displacement? Okay, so, sir, how can we differentiate distance and displacement in this given illustration? Okay, so when we say distance or the total distance, since it is an example of a scalar quantity, so therefore it has no direction. Okay, so when we say distance, it is the combination or the sum of the physical length, or it is the sum of the distance that you have traveled from your home to your school. So it is the combination or the sum of the physical length. For example, in this case, the distance in this case is the combination of or the sum of 16 kilometers and 12 kilometers, and that is equal to 28 kilometers. So since it has no specific direction, so therefore it is an example of a scalar quantity. Okay? So since it has no specific direction, so therefore it is an example of a scalar quantity. And on the other hand, when we say displacement, it is the shortest route or the shortest distance from your original position. Okay, so when we say displacement, it is the shortest route or the shortest distance from your original position up to your final position, which in this case is the yellow arrow. So your original position is your home and your final position is the school. So the shortest route or the shortest distance from your original position to your final position, which in this case is the 20 kilometers. Okay. And when we say displacement, since it is an example of a vector quantity, so it has to be have a direction. Okay, so which in this case, we haven't know yet the direction of the 20 kilometers. Okay, so the question is, how can we determine the direction of this specific vector given? Okay, so before we uh, before we proceed in determining the direction or to identify the direction of a given vector, first let us review on the determining direction in a Cartesian plane. Okay, so before we proceed in determining direction of a given vector, so first let us identify first um, let us first determine directions in a Cartesian plane. Okay, so I think you're familiar with Cartesian plane, and we all know that the Cartesian plane consists of two main axes. So there are two lines intersecting with each other, and that two lines is our main axis, which are the x and the y axis. X-axis is the horizontal lines, and y-axis is the vertical line. And a distance or the angle distance from x-axis to the y-axis, since it is perpendicular, so therefore it is equal to 90 degree. So if this is your origin, which is equal to 0 degree, so the distance from the x-axis or the angle distance from the x-axis to the y-axis, since it is perpendicular, so therefore it is equal to 90 degree. So so the distance from y to x is also 90 degrees. So if we add, it is 180. So another 90 degree, it is 270. And also another 90, it is 360 degree. And that is a one rotation from the x-axis, then go back to the x-axis. And that is equal to 360 degree. And each of these angle, okay, so as mentioned earlier, the direction, which is the north, the south, the east, and the west, is determined through degrees. So what is the equivalent degrees of those particular direction? Okay, so this degree or this angle has an equivalent direction. For example, for 90 degree, we have the north, the west, then 270 is the south, and 360 or the 0 degree is the east. So this angle or this degree of angle is also has an equivalent direction. Okay, so as we can see, the angle is in positive. Okay, sir, bakit ito positive? Is there any negative angle? May negative ba na angle? Okay, so it is positive because the rotation of your angle is counterclockwise. So since it is counterclockwise, so therefore the angle or the degree of your angle is positive. But if the rotation of your angle is clockwise, then it is negative. Okay, so do not get confused with the negative and the positive angle because, okay, take note, the negative and the positive is just an indicator of either it is a counterclockwise movement or a clockwise movement. Okay, so I repeat, the negative and the positive sign of your angle is just an indicator if it is a counterclockwise movement or a clockwise movement. Okay, but for our angle, in our direction, especially in our direction, we should get the absolute value of our angle. Okay, take note, the absolute value of our angle. Because as I have mentioned, the positive and negative sign of our angle is just an indicator. So when we say it is just an indicator, so it only tells us which way is the rotation of your angle. If it is counterclockwise, so therefore it is positive. If it is clockwise, and then it means negative. But for our direction, we need to get the absolute value of our angle. Okay? Am I clear? Okay. So that is the equivalent angle or equivalent degree of our direction, the four main directions, the north, the south, the east, and the west. Okay, so let's have an example in determining direction. So, sir, what if, okay, so that is the angle or the direction if the vector lies on the four or the on the two main axes. But what if the vector lies between the two axes? Okay, for example, in this case, so the theta is equal to 45 degrees. So since it does not lie on the main axis, which is the x and the y axis, so paano natin malalaman ang direction ng itong vector na ito? So if kanina, it is only on the north, south, east, and west, okay, this time it is between the north and the east. So how can we determine the direction of this particular vector? Okay, to determine the direction of this vector, okay, so first is we have to identify where does your angle started. So since this given angle of your vector started from the, so since this given angle of your vector started from the east and then it moves upward to the north. So since it started from the east and then it moves upward to the north. So therefore, the direction of your angle is now north of east. Okay, so remember, the first direction is indicates where it ended or saan papunta ang angle. And then the second direction or the direction after the word of indicates if saan nagsimula ang iyong angle. So which in this case, so as we can see on the green arrow, the tail of our angle started from the east and then it moves upward to the north. So therefore, the direction is now north of east. And to complete our direction, including the magnitude, so angle theta or the direction is now equal to 45 degree north of east. And take note, okay? Okay, take note of this. The angle theta or the angle of your direction should start from the x-axis. Okay, so the angle theta or the angle of your direction should start from the x-axis. Okay, so I repeat. So ulitin ko, the angle theta or the angle of your direction ay dapat magsisimula mula sa x-axis. So when we say it should start from the x-axis, so therefore it should start from either from the west or from the east. Okay? So let's have another example. An example that may help us to understand what is the meaning of it should start from the x-axis. Okay. So what if this is the case? So angle theta is equal to 120 degree. Okay. So take note, our angle of direction should not greater than 90 degree. Okay. So the angle of direction, okay, the angle of our direction is always less than 90 degree. So it is always less than 90 degree. So kung ito ay equal to 90 degree or kung ito ay mas mahigit pa sa 90 degree, then we should lessen its value. So dapat pababain natin ang kanyang value. We should lessen its value so that it may become less than 90 degree. So we lessen its value para magiging mas mababa siya sa 90 degree. So how to lessen the value of our angle, which in this case is equal to 120 degree? Okay, how to lessen? Since it passes through the axis, through the y-axis. So since it passes through the axis of the north, and we all know that north is equal to 90 degree. So therefore, we subtract. So we subtract the angle that is equivalent to the axis of the north, and that is equal to 90 degree. So 120 degree minus 90 degree is now equal to 30 degree. And since we subtracted 90 degree, which is the angle equivalent to the north, so therefore, instead, so since we subtracted the angle of the north, which is equivalent to 90 degree, so therefore, instead of starting from the east, Now our angle that is equivalent to 30 degree will now start from the north. And sabi ko kanina, our angle should start from the x-axis. So since this 30 degree started from the y-axis, so ililipat natin siya dito sa baba, which started from the west. So paano natin siya ililipat? So since north to west is equal to 90 degree, so therefore, we will subtract the angle that is equivalent to 30 degree to 90 degree, and that is 60 degree. So since 60 degree started from the x-axis, so therefore, the angle theta is now equal to 60 degree, and since it started from the west, so since it started from the west and then moves upward to the north, so therefore, okay, so I repeat, so since it started from the west, then moves upward to the north, so therefore, the direction of this particular angle is north of west. And to complete our answer, it is now equal to 60 degree north of west. So that is how to determine a direction of a certain vector. Okay? So for another example, okay, if this is our given vector, okay, if this is our given vector, so if the angle is 333 degree, so as I have mentioned kanina, the angle theta should always be less than 90 degree. So since it is 330 degree, so kailangan natin siya i-lessen. So since it passes through the axis of the south, so we will subtract the angle that is equivalent to the south, which is 270 degree, and that is equal to 63 degree. And since our angle should start from the x-axis, so since we should start from the x-axis, so therefore, we will subtract 63 degree to the 90 degree since it is the equivalent of south to east. And that is 27 degree. And since the angle theta, which is the blue arrow, started from the east, then it moves downward to the south. So therefore, the angle or the direction of our angle is south of west. And to complete this, theta is equal to 27 degree south of east. So that is how to determine direction using a Cartesian plane. And speaking of Cartesian plane, so since I mentioned earlier that the Cartesian plane has two main axes, which is the x and the y axis, and these two axes is also divided into two signs, the positive and the negative. So if the intersection of our axis is the origin, so this is the part where the x and the y axis is divided into positive and negative. So for x axis, which is the horizontal line, so origin to the right is the positive x, and from origin to the left is the negative x. So origin upward is positive y, and downward is negative y. So therefore, if the Cartesian plane is divided into four quadrants, so this is the first, the second quadrant, Then we have the third quadrant, and last is the fourth quadrant. So for the first quadrant, the x and the y are both positive. For the second quadrant, the x is negative and the y is positive. For the third quadrant, both x and y are negative. And for the fourth quadrant, x is positive and y is negative. So that is the sign convention of x and y in a Cartesian plane. Okay? So since we are talking about the direction and the angles, so since we are using angles, so therefore in angle, to be able to identify an angle of a certain vector, we will use the basic trigonometric functions. Okay, so to recap the basic trigonometric function, it is only applicable to a right triangle. Okay, take note, the basic trigonometric function is only applicable to right triangle. And what are these basic trigonometric functions? Then we have the SOHCAHTOA. So SOHCAHTOA, sine means opposite over hypotenuse, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, and tangent is opposite over hypotenuse. Pero sir, how can we determine opposite side, adjacent side, and hypotenuse side? Okay, to, to be able to determine the opposite, the adjacent, and the hypotenuse side, your point of reference is always the position of your angle. Okay, for example, if this is the position of your angle, okay, take note, only the adjacent and the opposite side can be interchangeable. So pwede na magkabali si opposite as adjacent, but the hypotenuse side, to determine the hypotenuse side, just look at the longest side of your right triangle. The longest side of your right triangle is the hypotenuse side. And paano malalaman the opposite and the adjacent side? Your reference is always the position of your angle. Okay, take note, position of your angle, kung saan nakalagay ang iyong angle. Okay. For example, if this is the case, so yan ang angle given, so angle theta. So opposite side, from the word opposite, so yung harap niya. So if this is the angle, so therefore ang harap niya is the opposite side. And the adjacent side is yung katabi niya. And do not get confused with the adjacent and the hypotenuse, because as I have mentioned, hypotenuse is always the longest side among the three. Okay, so what if andito na naman ang ating angle? So if this is the position of our angle, so therefore the opposite is yung kaharap, the adjacent is yung katabi, and the hypotenuse is always the longest. Okay, so that is how to determine the opposite and the adjacent side of your right triangle. Okay, so that is how to determine the adjacent, the opposite, and the hypotenuse side of a right triangle, so that we may be able to apply the basic trigonometric functions, which are the we may be able to apply the basic trigonometric functions, which are the sine, cosine, and the tangent functions. Okay, so vectors, when we combined vectors, so combining vectors is, or adding vectors is called the resultant. So if we add two or more vectors, that is what we call the resultant. Okay, so resultant or the vector sum, that is equivalent to two or more vectors. So when we add vectors, we call this the resultant. And how to add vectors? Okay, to add vectors, okay, we have the analytical method. So the method of adding vectors, first we have the analytical method. And in this analytical method, we have a three types in analytical method, and that is employing Pythagorean theorem, the component method, and the trigonometric functions. Okay, so these are the types of analytical method. So the employing Pythagorean theorem on the component method as well as the trigonometric function. So these are some examples or method in adding vectors. But before we proceed with analytical method, first let's discuss how to add vectors if they act on the same axis. So how to add vectors or how to combine vectors if they act in the same axis. So what does it mean when we say they act on the same axis? Okay, so that means if that particular vectors lies on the main axis, the x and the y axis, and they are both on the same axis. Okay, for example, if 2 or 3 or 4 vectors is on the x-axis, or either 2, 3, or 4 or more vectors is on the y-axis. So that is vectors acting on the same axis. So how to combine this? Okay, so we have two rules in that matter. First is if they are in the same direction. So first is if they are in the same direction. For example, in this case, 16 kilometer and 12 kilometers are both on the y-axis and they are in the same direction. So therefore, we just simply add their vector or the magnitude. So 16 plus 12, and then follow their direction, which is going to the north. So that is how we add vectors or we combine vectors if they are in the same direction. But what if they are in opposite direction? So opposite direction, for example, in this case, 12 kilometers moves towards right and 16 kilometers moves towards uh, left. Okay, so if this is the case, if they act on this on opposite direction, then what we need to do is to subtract their magnitude. So subtract their magnitude and then copy the direction of the bigger or the larger magnitude or the larger vector. So for example, in this case, so 12 and 16, so we subtract them. So it is equal to 4 kilometers. 4 kilometers. So since 16 kilometers is greater than 12, so therefore we follow the direction of 16 kilometers, which is going to the left. And take note, if we subtract two or more vectors, the answer should have the absolute value of its magnitude. So if we subtract two or more vectors, so the answer should have the absolute value. So regardless if it is positive or negative, Then since we need the absolute value, so it is always positive. So let's have an example. For example, a bus travels 9 kilometers east, stop, and continues to move 15 kilometers east. So what is the displacement of the bus? Okay, so as we can observe or as we can see, the direction of the movement of the bus is towards east, though it stopped for a moment, but it continues to move towards east. So therefore, the movement is in the same direction. So what to do if they are in the same direction? As I have mentioned kanina, add the magnitude and then copy the direction or follow the direction. So add the magnitude. So 9 plus 15 kilometers is equal to 24 kilometer. And since the direction is going to the east, so therefore we will follow the direction which is going to the east, and that is the displacement of the bus is now equal to 24 kilometer to the east. So just add their magnitude and then follow their direction. So that is if they are in the same direction. But what if they are in opposite direction? So 25 kilometers east, stop, and returns 42 kilometers west. Okay, so as we can see, the bus travels, so pumunta siya ng 25 kilometers patungong east, pero bumalik naman siya ng 42 kilometers papuntang west. So, they are in opposite direction. So, since the bus travels two different direction, so therefore, the displacement of the bus, what is the displacement of this bus? Okay, so if they are in opposite direction, we just simply subtract the magnitude and then follow the direction of the bigger magnitude or the larger magnitude. So, for example, with this case, so 25 kilometers east minus 42 kilometers west. So yun yung sinasabi ko kanina. So we need to get the absolute value of our direction or the magnitude. So 25 minus 42, so alam naman natin that it is equal to negative 17. But since we only need the absolute value, so tanggalin natin ang negative sign and it is now equal to 17 kilometer. And after that, identify the direction. Since mas malaki si 42 kilometers, so therefore, ang kanyang direction ang ating i-follow. So 42 kilometers is going to the west. And so, we will follow its direction that is going to the west. And so, the displacement of the bus is now equal to 17 kilometer west. So, that is how we add vectors if they act on the same axis. But, what if the vectors are on different axes? Okay, so anong gagawin natin or how can we identify the resultant if the vectors are on different axes? So, one of the vector is on the x-axis and one of the vector is on the y-axis. So, anong gagawin natin pag ganun? So, if that is the case, then we will apply the so we will apply the vectors acting at a right angle. So this is called as the vectors acting at a right angle. So one of the vector is on the x-axis and the other is on the y-axis. So if that is the case, then we will apply these following rules. First is we have to illustrate the vectors and its resultant vector. Okay, so to illustrate, first is we need to connect the first vector and the second vector. So connect head to tail. The tail of the second vector should be connected to the head of the first vector. Okay, take note. The head of the vector is the one that has an arrow, and the tail is the one that is a plane or straight. So, yung may arrow na sign, that is the head, and then yung may straight lang, that is the tail of your vector. Okay, then after you connect the head and the tail, draw your resultant line from the tail of your first vector to the head of your second vector. And after you draw your resultant line, and then you can create a right triangle. Okay, since the first vector is in the x-axis and the second vector is on the y-axis, if we connect the two and then draw a resultant from these two vectors, so therefore we can create a right triangle. So since it is a right triangle, to solve for the resultant, we can say that the right triangle is the hypotenuse of our right triangle. So since it is a right triangle and since hindi given yung angle, so therefore we can use the Pythagorean theorem to determine the resultant of your vector. And lastly is to solve for the angular direction. And since it is a right triangle, then we can apply the basic trigonometric functions, or simply we can apply the tangent function. Okay? So, sir, bakit tangent function? Hindi ba pwede na si sine or si cosine? Okay. So, since the two vectors, which is the x and the y, is the opposite and the adjacent side, so therefore, we can use the tangent function. So, that is how to determine the resultant and the direction of our resultant. Okay, so, let us try. See, try muna natin kung paano gawin itong step na to. Okay, so first is the first step. Connect head to tail. Okay? So if this is your first vector, from the head of your first vector, so yung head is yung may arrow na sign. So from the head of your second vector, then you connect the tail of your second vector. Okay, so as you can see, we can form a right angle from the two vectors. So after you connect the head and the tail, after you connect the two vectors, then draw your resultant line. So if this is the tail of your first vector, and this is the head of your last vector, your second vector, then we can connect these two to draw the resultant line. Okay? So that is the resultant line. So as we can see, we can create a right triangle. So after you create a right triangle, then we can apply Pythagorean theorem to identify or to determine the resultant. So speaking of Pythagorean theorem, so the Pythagorean theorem is, so if the resultant is the C side, then A and B, so square root of C, or C is equal to the square root of the C is equal to the square root of A square plus B square. So that is the Pythagorean theorem. And after determining your resultant, next is to solve for your angular direction. Okay. As mentioned kanina, gaya ng sabi ko kanina, the angular direction should start from the x-axis. So dapat it should start from the x-axis. So since in this case, the x-axis is yung letter A, So dyan magsisimula ang ating angle papunta sa resultant line. So that is our angle theta. So tan is equal to opposite over adjacent, which is equal to B over A. So that is how to determine the resultant and the angular direction of our resultant. So, let's have an example para mas maintindihan. So, mas madaling maintindihan kapag may example. Sige, let's have an example. Okay, a man walks 95 kilometers east, then 55 kilometers north. So, calculate his resultant displacement. Okay, so if he walked 95 kilometers east and then 55 kilometers north. Okay, take note. So we connect the two vectors. After that, draw the resultant line. And then solve for your resultant using the Pythagorean theorem. So using the Pythagorean theorem, C is equal to A squared plus B squared. Then substitute your vectors. So we have C is the square root of 95 square plus 55 kilometers square. So if we solve this, if we input this in your calculator, and then the result is equal to 110 kilometers. Sir, bakit 110? Okay. So, according to the rule of the significant figure in multiplication, okay, so in multiplication, the rule in significant figure, the answer should follow the least number of significant figure. So since the least number of significant figure according to the given, it has two significant figure. So therefore, we will follow the answer that it also has two significant figures. So that is the reason that it is equal to 110 kilometers. Okay, take note, sabi ko noon, we follow the rules in significant figures. So, if nakalimutan na, then take time to review the rules in significant figure. Okay? So, if C is equal to 110 kilometers and C is equal to resultant, so therefore, the resultant is equal to 110 kilometers. And after you solve for the resultant, next is to solve for its angular direction. Okay. So to solve for its angular direction, gaya ng sabi ko, dapat ito ay magsisimula from the x-axis. And since 95 kilometers is the x-axis, so therefore it started from 95 kilometer east and then move forward to the resultant. So if that is the case, then the opposite side, according to the position of our angle, is the 55 kilometer. If tan theta is equivalent to opposite over adjacent, so therefore to substitute, if the opposite is 55, so substitute. Then after that, so transpose the tangent sign. So from theta, gawin natin siyang arctan. So since we transpose, sir, paano gawin si tan? Si arctan. So to get the arctan, just click shift, then tangent, and then 55 divided by 95, and that is equivalent to theta is equal to 30 point degree. Sir, bakit 30 point degree? Bakit hindi siya 30 lang or 30.0? Okay? Because, as mentioned, according to the rule of the significant figure, in multiplication, the answer should have the least number of significant figure. So the least number is 55, or the least number is two significant figures. So therefore, our answer should also have two significant figure. So since arctan 55/95 is equivalent to, I think, it is 30.06 and so on. So to make it two significant figure, then we will make it 30.10 degree, and that is our angle. Okay, so in applying the trigonometric functions, make sure that your calculator is in degree form. Baka naka-radian ang iyong calculator. So before you using that calculator, make sure it is on degree form. So i-clear nyo muna ang memory to make it degree. Okay? So for the final answer, we have the, okay, and since it started from the east, then it moves forward to the north. And so the final answer is 110 kilometers, then comma, 30 degree, then north of east. Okay, so that is the answer or the displacement of the man from the that walks 95 kilometers east and 55 kilometers north. Okay, so let's have another example. Okay, so a boat moves with a velocity of 15 meters per second north in a river which flows with a velocity of 8.0 meters per second west. So calculate the boat's resultant velocity. Okay, so calculate the boat's resultant velocity. So if the boat is moving 15 meters per second going to the north, but the current, so if the, okay, so if the boat is moving 15 meters per second going to the north, but the current of the river is pushing the boat 8.0 meters per second through the west. So, tinutulak ng river ang boat, or the current of the river is pushing the boat 8.0 meters papatunta or patungong west. So, the question is calculate the resultant velocity of the boat with respect to the north. And since, so this is the resultant velocity of the boat, and since specific yung question, that the angular direction should respect to the north, so therefore, the angle or the angular direction of our velocity or the resultant should started from the north, then moves leftward to the west. Okay? Kasi specific yung tanong eh. Okay, so to solve for the resultant using the Pythagorean theorem, so 8.0 square plus 15 square. So the resultant is now equal to 17 meters per second. So that is the resultant after applying the Pythagorean theorem. Okay, next is to solve for the angular direction. Since specific siya that dapat it has to be with respect to the north, so dapat magsisimula ang ating angle from north, then moves leftward to the west. So that is our angle theta. And to solve this, using the tangent function, tan theta is equal to opposite over adjacent. Okay? So tan theta is equal to 8.0 divided by 15. So since our angle theta, the opposite of our angle theta is 8.0, and the adjacent is equal to 15 meters per second. And so if we compute this using our calculator, so it is equal to 28 degrees. And so our final answer is now equal to 17 meter per second, then comma, 28 degree, then west of north. Sir, bakit west of north? Sabi mo kanina, it should have respect to the, dapat magsisimula siya sa x-axis. Okay, so since specific yung question that the angular direction should have with respect to the north, so dapat magsisimula siya sa north. So from north, it moves towards east. So therefore, it is west of north. Okay, so that is how we solve the resultant of a given vector in a if they both act on the same axis and if they both act on different axis. So ganun, so mas madali ang pagkuha ng resultant if they are in the same axis than solving for the resultant if they are in different axis. But what if? Okay, so as you can observe, the vectors given are it only has two vectors. So what if it has three or more vectors and then two of it is on the same axis and two of it is on different axis? So dalawa ang sa x-axis and dalawa ang sa y-axis, or 2 or 3 ang sa x and 2 or more ang sa y. So anong gagawin natin? So if that is the case, for example, in this given example, okay, a soldier walks 8 kilometers east, then 5 kilometers north, then walks 1 kilometer west, and finally walks 2 kilometers south until he arrives at their camp. So calculate the soldier's displacement. Okay, so first, let us illustrate this para mas makita natin siya. And okay, so first, let us illustrate. Okay, so if this is the man, he walks 8 kilometers east, and then going north, and then west, and then south. So what is the resultant displacement of this man? So if this is the resultant, okay, so if this is the case, as we can see, letter A and letter C is on the same. They are both in the x-axis. Letter B and letter D are also on the same axis. They are on y-axis. So if this is the case, so therefore, we will combine the steps on getting the resultant if they act on the same axis and if they act on different axis. So, paano natin yun makukuha? Okay, so, how can we solve for the resultant? Okay, first, in getting our resultant, first is we need to solve for its x component or the resultant x component and the resultant y component. So this is what we call the component method. Okay? So in component method, first we need to solve for its x component and the y component. So sir, paano namin makukuha si x and y component? Okay, to solve for x and y component, in R sub x, we will combine all the vectors acting on the x-axis. And for y component, we will combine all the vectors acting on the y components. Okay, so for example, for R sub x, so the vectors in the x-axis is the 8 kilometers east and the 1 kilometer west. So we will combine this since they are in different direction. So we subtract. So after that, we will follow the direction of the bigger magnitude. So 8 kilometer is greater than 1 kilometer. So i-follow natin ang kanyang direction. So R sub x is now equal to 7 kilometers east. And for R sub y, okay, for R sub y, since the vectors acting on the the y-axis according to our question, is the 5 kilometer north and the 2 kilometers south. So which is the vector B and the vector D. So if we combine this, since they are different direction, so subtract. So after you subtract, it is 3 kilometers. And then follow the direction of the bigger magnitude, which is 5 kilometers. So it is now 3 kilometers north. So now we have our r sub x and r sub y. So we can now solve for our resultant. Okay, so the resultant, which has the x and the y components. So to solve using the Pythagorean theorem, okay, so using the Pythagorean theorem, rx squared plus ry squared. So substitute 7 squared plus 3 squared. So r is equal to 8 kilometers. So that is how to solve the resultant. Okay, next is the angular direction. The angular direction with respect to the x-axis. So it should start from the x-axis. So since the x-axis is the r sub x, so dyan magsisimula ang ating angle papuntang sa resultant. So that is angle theta. So angle theta. So tan theta is equal to the opposite, which is the r sub y, and the adjacent, which is the r sub x. So 3 divided by 7. So theta is equal to arctan 3 kilometers divided by 7 kilometers. And that is also equal to 20 degree. Okay? And for its direction, since it started from east and then it moves upward to the north, so therefore, the angular direction or the direction of our angle is now becomes the north of east. So the direction is north of east. Since it started from the east, then it moves upward to the north. And so our final answer is 8 kilometers, then comma, 20 degree north of east. So that is how to solve for our